we're going to keep on doing what we've been doing. Our approach is what it's always been.
Chrystia Freeland wants to assure Canadians that the Liberal government is going to continue to do things the way they have been doing things over the past 11 years, and I believe that all the evidence we can look at supports the contention. Welcome back to the Canadian Shield. My name is Sterling. Got a lot to cover in this episode. We're going to be talking about the rules that were released and how they are discriminatory in the NDP's leadership contest. And we want to talk about how Fraser has taken a shot at Pierre Poilievre because Pierre Poilievre has demanded that Canadians feel safe inside of their own homes. I think that sums up a couple of things, though. First off, the fact that Mark Carney has done nothing, has accomplished nothing, and he made a lot of promises and he has came through with none of it. Absolutely none of it. And on top of that, Chrystia Freeland saying the Liberal Party isn't going to change the way they do things. And I can see how over the last 11 years that they have done nothing but make matters worse. And this is exactly the same situation that we can see from the Mark Carney government, making a whole bunch of promises on the campaign trail, stirring up all kinds of fear and anxiety and issues on the campaign trail, and then quietly trying to distance himself from all of those exact same things. This is the kind of government that Canada does not need. All right, let's move over to the NDP leadership race. They released the rules for said leadership race, and it can only be described as discriminatory. I got picked this up from the National Post. The NDP leadership is underway, and the party is limiting signatures from cis men. We'll get back to that in a second. So, I'm not going to read through the whole article, but I'll tell you a couple of things that they did mention. Prospective candidates will need to collect at least 500 signatures from party members, including a minimum of 50 from each of the 5 regions: Atlantic, Quebec, Ontario, the Prairies, as well as British Columbia and the Territories. Rules indicate that at least 50% of the total required signatures must be from NDP members who do not identify as cisgender men, meaning the male who reported gender corresponds to their reported sex at birth. The party also requires a minimum of 100 signatures from the equity-seeking groups such as racialized members, Indigenous members, and members of the LGBTQ plus community and persons living with disabilities. And of course, every last little bit of that is discriminatory. To limit the amount of signatures from a particular group, that's discrimination. If I were to take that group, cisgender, which we'll call males, and just switch it out. Just say that I am not allowed to have any more than half signatures from women, not any more than half the signatures from the LGB. How about saying that I'm not allowed to have any more than half the signatures from a particular racial group? So you can see that none of that would fly. And I get that on the far left, they tell themselves that they're allowed to pick and choose what's discriminatory and what isn't. But I'm telling you that this is no way, shape, or form the kind of Prime Minister that Canada needs, deserves, or wants. I'm saying to you that this is a group of lawyers who think that by telling you that they've collected signatures from a specific groups of people and have limited a specific group of individuals from signing on, they are somehow doing something that is important for the country. And then they wonder why nobody voted for them. They wonder why their party is in tatters. Global News is reporting that the RCMP in British Columbia have wrapped up their 8-year investigation into residential schools, and there is no evidence of any clandestine burials. I can't believe we're still talking about that, actually, because to my mind, it should have been put to very simple and straightforward logic. Now, work with me here. If you say to me that before the Caucasian arrived in North America, the peoples of the First Nations were crossing back and forth, nomadic, all the rest of that. So what you want me to understand is that you were passing season to season from different regions, and I accept that. However, what I don't see is any evidence of burial. I don't see any evidence of, graveyards from the First Nations peoples before the arrival of the Caucasian. For all of this nomadic lifestyle, there should have been evidence of where those particular places of rest were marked. But you see what they don't tell you, what they leave out of the calculation is that making a gravestone, is a difficult, expensive, and timely thing, and it requires tools to chisel out the words and all the rest of that. And that wasn't technology that was possessed by, or at least exploited by, the peoples of the First Nations. So when you say to me that in the residential schools there was no marked graves, I say to you, okay, well, let's just look at that from a modern perspective. We can't even get schools to pay for gym class nowadays, or music class, and you want me to believe that somehow in the far reaches of the northern Manitoba, Saskatchewan, whatever you want to be, British Columbia in this example, somehow the school that's trying to keep all of its residents fed and housed and all the rest of that, we're going to phone into no, they were going to send a person on by courier with a letter requesting that the school board that they were working for pay for a gravestone made chiseled, then put onto a horse and carriage, dragged through all the same very same wilderness, and set there to mark the passing of said individual. And of course, the school board, whatever their best intentions were going to be, they don't have that kind of money. They didn't have it then. They don't have it now. I mean, that's the thing that you always hear out of a school board, right? That they're always crying poor. So how would you expect me to believe that there's going to be any evidence of it? I can tell you right now that I don't for one second believe that they weren't put into consecrated ground. Pierre Poilievre has taken a swipe at the Liberal Party and Mark Carney specifically on his lack of productivity on the LNG. Canada should be trouncing the U.S. on LNG because the Americans released some numbers just saying a little while back, a couple of days back, that they have increased their amount of LNG they're exporting to the world by 11% in the last 7 months. We have shorter shipping distances to Asia and Europe, cold weather making it 25% cheaper to liquefy and abundant power to do so. But Liberals have closed Canada for business, blocking 18 LNG plants. 5 months as PM, Carney hasn't approved a single one, and all the same Liberal laws stand in the way. And then he puts get out of the way, which I agree with him completely. You need to get out of the way. Canada needs to tell the Liberal Party that they get out of the way. No matter what your politics are, what we want are jobs. We want our productivity. Obviously, all Canadians want some prosperity, and the only thing that's standing in the way is the Liberal government. You can tell yourself that you agree with some of their policies, but their business policies are horrible. The whole wide world has abandoned the ESG. No other country in the world is targeting the carbon releases. No other country in the world is going to this extreme, to these extents. They are allowing their people to do well and to thrive on the actual product that's being manufactured. And the more we make, the better the global south does, because then we'll have an abundance to send to them as well. So really, all the Liberal government is doing is not only interfering with the way Canada should be developed, but they're also getting in the way of countries that have never in their histories been developed. And we as Canadians could be not only exporting this product, but exporting the technology and the philosophy that goes along with that, as we would be the source of that supply of energy, that supply of change, that supply of growth. So the Liberal Party, in their very short-sighted, very narrow-minded approach to almost everything that they do, is actually not only interfering with Canada's development, but they're interfering with the development of some of the poorest countries on earth. Also, they can tell themselves that somehow they're going to be ESG superstars. As if we needed more proof that the EV mandate is a bad idea and that LNG is important to get the world up and running, that fossil fuels are something that the world still requires, and that electricity is not anywhere near where we need it to be. Northvolt, a company that used to be based in Sweden, and then they declared bankruptcy, and then they were in bankruptcy protection in North America, and Quebec had put all kinds of money into the kitty to have them come over into Quebec and start to make batteries. Then they went into bankruptcy protection, and Quebec has lost all of their investments. A year after everyone else, the Legault government finally admits Northvolt is a failure. $270 million in taxpayers' money is gone. That's about what happens when politicians gamble our money. Instead, they should cut business taxes to make us more competitive and attractive. And you can see there, Quebec declares Northvolt battery plant partnership dead, loses $270 million investment. Of course, anybody could have told them a year ago that they should stop putting in any money, and they should have done a little bit of research. They should have just done a little bit of foresight and understood that there was never going to be any market for that kind of a product, even if everybody was in love with the idea, which they are not. The houses are not set up for it. The high density is not set up for it. I mean, you're talking about, there are parts of this world in North America that are supposed to be in the developed land, and they tell you that every time people come home after work at 5 o'clock and they turn on the air conditioners, it causes brownouts. Can you imagine at the same time they turned on their air conditioner, they plugged in their car? I mean, that would just completely shatter the grid, and the grid is not set up for it. Cold is not good for a battery. It's not good for the torque that it puts down. I mean, there are so many things that are against EV cars in Canada, that the Quebec government should have understood that and should have been more careful and more responsible with taxpayers' money. However, we can see that the Liberal government needs to also take a lesson from this and stop trying to force Canadians to buy electric cars. Stop trying to force our dwindling car manufacturing industry to be putting only electric vehicles on the lot and trying to force Canadians to purchase a car that they can't charge once they get it home. I mean, if you've ever been to Toronto, or if you can look at the pictures of the skyline of, say, Toronto or Vancouver, all of that high density. How are people going to get home and plug that into their building where they parked their car? I mean, imagine, in some cases, insurance companies don't want these electric vehicles to be charged indoors at all. So there is so many things that are wrong with the electric vehicle mandate. And by extension, anybody who's trying to implement that mandate, including Mark Carney, Stephen Guilbeault, DeBruzen, and the whole front bench of the Liberal Party. Now, speaking of the front bench of the Liberal Party, Freeland was holding a big conference over how she wanted to have all the steel and aluminum manufacturers together, and they were going to be talking about how they can invest that in Canadian industry. And one of the reporters asked her that question. And it always shocks me that they don't have an answer for their own reporter staff. I mean, there's only 4 companies that they permit to talk to them. So why would they have any questions that come from them that they don't already have the answers to? So Freeland was asked about the British Columbia ferries and how they're spending all of that money in China using Chinese steel to build these ferries rather than to be building them in Canada with Canadian steel and aluminum. And her answer:
one of the main issues that we talked about today is ferries. We talked about how the Canadian ferry fleet at all levels, both the federal ferries and the provincial ferries, needs to be renewed. And we had the shipbuilders here today to hear from them what it's going to take to make it possible for them to bid on those contracts. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but what we heard from the Canadian shipbuilders, and we had a number of shipbuilders here, both the 3 big shipyards, but also other shipyards, including Ontario shipyards. And we heard from them tremendous enthusiasm to build Canadian ships and to build Canadian ferries and to use Canadian steel and aluminum when they build those ships and ferries here in Canada. I was very encouraged and inspired by that.
Now, I didn't hear an answer at all. I heard a whole bunch of gobbledygook. I heard a whole bunch of talk and meandering through a thought, but I didn't hear a direct answer to the question, why are we still sending $1 billion to China to build ships in China with Chinese steel when we should be building ships in Canada with Canadian steel and aluminum? And she talked and talked and talked, and you heard her. Now, I will say a couple of things. First of all, no reason to involve any of the big 3. The big 3 are taking our money and they're building it in shipyards overseas, and they're doing that for a couple of reasons. The biggest, of course, is that the tax rates in Canada are enormous. So any of the contracts that these ships get, they are paying half of it into the federal kitty. Other things, too, to think about is that you need a shipyard to build it. A shipyard is something that is very extensive. It's very large. It requires a lot of people. I mean, you can't build a ferry and put it on the back of a truck and take it in parts like you want. The government thinks that they're going to be doing with houses. You have to build it, then put it right into the water, and then sail it to wherever it's going to be put into use. So imagine that when our icebreakers come here from Texas, they're going to have sailed here. Nonetheless, the Liberal government doesn't seem to understand that at all. They don't really seem to understand how ships are built. And Freeland, she sounds like it's all about who feels good, and we all got together and we all held one another's shoulders and sang campfire songs or something to that effect. There are a lot of jobs put into building boats, and we don't need the big shipyards to be building ferries, regional ferries most especially. But I understand that every ferry that we're talking about is going to have room for cars and trucks on it, especially when you consider that the ferries that feed the north are very important to trucking. And when we talk about getting things up to to the northern part of the country, what we have to be thinking about is supplies, right? People can get there. It's getting the drywall they need, the groceries they need, those kinds of products up there. That's the real tricky, the copper piping they need or whatever it happens to be. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be addressing when we're looking at developing this nation. And when we're developing this nation, we have to ask ourselves, do we really feel that the Liberal government putting the brakes on everyone around us is a good way to go? Now, one of the things the Liberal government, or as the federal government, they are responsible for is the Criminal Code of Canada. And many people are talking about the Castle Doctrine, the stand your ground, the self-defense, all of the things that are going on as a result of much of coming out of the Lindsay. And Sean Fraser, who, as you can well imagine, had something to say because Pierre Poilievre weighed in on the subject. Well, that is quite the response that came from Minister Fraser. Pierre Poilievre had talked about how he doesn't believe that the Lindsay situation is fair and just and that Canadians should have the right to defend themselves. And this minister from, Nova Scotia, Sean Fraser, he says Canadians already have the right to defend themselves under a law Harper brought in with Poilievre's support. Does he not understand that someone's being charged for defending themselves inside of their own home? And if that's the case, how come it is there's a law, right? I mean, what are you talking about? What are you actually saying? Now he's chasing a photo op by attacking police for doing their jobs. I trust police to lay charges and judges to consider evidence over Pierre Poilievre's cops and robbers. And then when you look down a little bit, the next thing he says is, this isn't the Wild West, it's Canada. Canadians deserve real solutions that make us safer, not slogans that inspire fear and chaos from Pierre Poilievre's political survival. Now, this is, of course, Sean Fraser never being able to withstand anything that Pierre Poilievre has to say. Sean Fraser can't stand Pierre Poilievre. He's constantly living in Sean Fraser's head, Pierre Poilievre does. I can't tell you the amount of times I saw Sean Fraser stand up thinking that he was going to be able to take him on, and Pierre Poilievre sat him down without even breaking a sweat. Sean Fraser can't really even seem to keep track of his own thoughts. That's how unarticulate he is with the spoken word. For example, he says that we already have these laws, and then the very next sentence, he says, oh no, I trust the police to lay the charges against the individual. So if you have the right to defend yourself, then you wouldn't be trusting the police to lay the charges. I mean, it's not one or the other. And when you're telling me that the crime rates as high as they are, it's not the Wild West. Well, I think that we need to revisit why it was called the Wild West. It was called the Wild West because there was no law and order. It was called the Wild West because it was every man for himself. And in many of these metropolitan areas, that's what it feels like. When you go to sleep at night and you're being told by the local law enforcement to leave your valuables at the door so that they don't try to come all the way into your house, you can't be telling yourself that that represents law and order. You simply cannot. And Minister Fraser standing up or putting up on the platform of X that somehow Pierre Poilievre demanding that the people have the right to sleep snug as a bug in a rug in their homes and not have to worry about these kinds of situations. And to understand that Pierre Poilievre is also asking for people to be put away for longer terms for these exact same horrendous crimes. And then Sean Fraser trying to stand up and put it on Harper and move the ball around and needle around only indicates just the scattering of his own mind. Like the idea that he really believed that what he said there was poignant and concise and was drawing a point that any of us would be able to follow. The only point that I see is a man was rambling and ranting and going on when he knew that his own government is responsible for the degradation of public safety in this country. All right, I'm going to wrap here. I want to thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next time.